thank you all for coming. And special thanks to my old professor, not old, my professor Laura, and David and Martha and Ken and all the other people who put this together, which is a really remarkable event. It's an honor to welcome Amy Baer, especially given what's been going on in Southern California for the last few weeks. So Amy, we're very pleased to have you. I first became aware of Amy when she founded Landline Pictures several years ago. In an LA Times article about Amy's new venture, she was quoted in part saying, "I've always had an affinity for people movies, movies that speak to a more mature audience that sometimes get overlooked in the development and production process. I've been a huge fan of hers ever since." Her company, Gidden Media, has produced the hit Las Vegas, the award-winning film Brian Banks, and most recently the critically acclaimed The Apprentice, about the early days of, She recently concluded a 6-year term as board president of Women in Film, when the industry was facing a reckoning over gender disparities and sexual harassment. She is married to producer Matt Baer and has 2 sons. On a personal note, her father, the great Tom Bosley, played Howard Cunningham, the father in the long-running TV hit series Happy Days, and I saw him on Broadway when I was about 7 years old in the play Fiorello. So Amy, welcome.
Thank you.
So some of our territory was covered in the previous panel brilliantly, but I'm going to ask you those questions anyway. So the description of this panel opens by saying, historically, older people are often underrepresented, mischaracterized, and stereotyped in film and television. But is that changing with shows like Man on the Inside, Grace and Frankie, and Shrinking? You work in the center of this industry. Are those underrepresentations, mischaracterizations, and stereotypes still prevalent, or have things actually changed in recent years?
I think the answer is both. I think yes, it's changing, and yes, it's still the same. I think there's I think we're in a moment right now where there are a lot of shows and films that are more relevant to an older audience by virtue of the fact that the protagonist is older. But it also is always met within the industry as sort of a shock and surprise that it succeeds. So I don't really know what accounts for the sort of incremental progress. Some of the ones you're talking about, Shrinking is very showrunner driven, had a previous relationship at Apple. The Harrison Ford character is a supporting character in that show, not the main character. Man on the Inside was a Oscar-winning documentary that was submitted a few years ago. I think it was Argentina. I actually tried to option it when I was still at Landline. So that took a long time to get going. So there is progress, but there's also still a lack of a clear commitment and agenda to telling those stories. It's sort of almost like they happen by accident.
What accounts for that lack of commitment to that agenda?
And I know you've all heard this before today. It's, I think, a fear of how to reach that audience. I mean, I think, the fundamental misconception is older audiences, and by older, I'm literally talking about people 45 and older, not 65 and older, which is, I think significant because you're talking about a very large swath of the population. I think that there is fear of monetizing that audience. And monetizing looks very different in depending on the distribution mechanism you're talking about. If it's theatrical motion pictures, it's getting people out of the house to go see a movie. If it's a television show, it's will they tune in on a broadcast network, or will they find the show on one of their subscriptions? If it's a streamer, it's a similar thing, which is this something that's enticing enough to get them to sign up, or have they already turned out? Or, the streaming metrics are also very different because it's about completion rates. It's not necessarily about ad revenue. So I think there's still a lot of, I know there's still a lot of trepidation within the industry to commit to this lane because of a lack of belief that they can actually monetize the audience.
Well, that jumps ahead to another question, but I'll get to that now. There are about 120 million people over 50 in the United States, about 1/3 of the total population, and we account for more than half of all consumer spending. So you've already addressed this, but when you and I talked the last week, we talked about you making a business case in the industry. So how would you make a business case that's in their interest to pay attention to this demographic? And given the fact that a lot, if not most of the decision makers in the industry are 50 or under, how difficult will that case be to make?
Well, I'm going to take the second part of that question first. I think that most of the decision makers are 50 and older. I think that a lot of the entry points to these buyers are under 50. I sold a movie to Warner Brothers Max 4 years ago, and the two people that bought it were over 50, and everybody at the table who read it who was under 40 didn't get it. And that's okay. I'm totally comfortable with that. I don't have a like this is, you shouldn't, not everybody has to like everything in the ecosystem that we live in. But I think part of the problem is that to use sort of business school speak, creators, whether they're directors, producers, writers, showrunners, creators are very aware of audience, right? So that's the B2C case. They're very aware that there's a consumer that is interested in the story that they're telling, or they tell themselves they believe that there is. The impediment continues to be the B2B case, which is, well, we can't monetize that audience. Well, they don't show up. Well, there's always excuses. And just to make the case, I brought some statistics. These are just recent examples of movies. So Conclave, I don't know if many of you have seen the movie yet, but it's in the Oscar race. It's a book adaptation, very successful film. 68% of opening weekend was over 40. Complete Unknown, which I'm sure many of you know of or have seen, Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan. The largest demographic opening weekend was over 55. That was 40% of the opening weekend audience. So every time, almost without fail, if you make a piece of content for this audience, they will watch it or they will show up for it. But every time the business case believes it's an aberration. And I think that we have to do a better job as an industry of looking to other industries who are starting to do this in a very successful way, and make the very nuts and bolts business case as to why this is an audience that is hiding in plain sight and you are leaving money on the table as a result of it. And there's a variety of ways to do it, but it's going to require the powers that drive the investment into the creation of content, whether that's banks that finance slates, whether it's in, VC with startup companies, whatever the case may be, there has to be a better job from the financial perspective on how this content can be monetized and can be sort of an evergreen, right? Because once it's even modestly successful here, every piece of content has a long tail. And that long tail continues to generate revenue. So and there's a lot being written about it now, but I don't think that I think that also the business is in a very weird transitional moment, but I don't feel like, I still think it's treated as a one-off, right? Like, oh, look, we made, that show or that movie and it worked for that audience. Isn't that nice? So, but if you look at, and I think you and I talked about this once, if you could go do a back of napkin analysis of 25, 30 years of movies and television shows that have worked, and if you're focusing on this audience in the right way, they almost always succeed. I would say 80% succeed financially, which is all that anybody really cares about in Hollywood, like truly, is making money. So that has to be the case in the same way that earlier panels were talking about. There's money to be made, in beauty. There's money to be made in healthcare. There's money to be made in entertainment by the companies that are funding entertainment, but the case has to be made in a more compelling way.
Wait, I want to hear more about this weird moment that the industry is in, but I also it's sort of axiomatic in the entertainment industry that biopics don't work. If period pieces don't work, except if you look at the history of Academy Award winning films, a lot of them were biopics and period pieces. But the disconnect between the reality of the performance of those shows and how it sinks into the decision makers seems to be a huge chasm. And I'm curious whether the same thing's going on in terms of mature audiences.
Yeah, I think that, well, I think that when I started working at Landline, and I'm not there anymore because the company that was funding it sort of made a right turn and kind of reconceived their own business plan. I still have projects with them that we're making. But when I started there, I was able to dig into a long list of films and look at the history of movies in this space and why they would work. And there were three elements that were really consistent, and they're still consistent to this day. Cost. So I worked on the Nancy Meyer movies when I was at Sony. You can't make these movies for $85 million, right? As much as people love The Holiday, it's probably too expensive a film, or something's got to give. So you have to make these at the right price point. You have to make them with an actor, not necessarily a star, but an actor that is meaningful to the audience you're trying to reach. And you need to make it about something that resonates on an emotional thematic level. So themes of starting over, second chances, grand adventures like Best Exotic Marigold Hotel or The Bucket List, like stories that tell stories like that. I mean, even when it comes to television shows, you look at the most recent example being Matlock, with Kathy Bates on CBS. There's, for those of you who haven't seen it, I won't spoil what the subplot is because you should watch the pilot, but the whole idea of it is a woman going back to work and trying to start her life again after something happens in it. So these are very, very relevant themes for an aging or, older audience. And it's a very, very distinct pattern. So what you have to do is say that you can make something at the right price, be very clear on what it's about. For example, don't make a ton of shows or movies about people in old age homes. It's the same issue as whoever was discussing it earlier. I forgot who, but very eloquently said they were looking at ads of like the sad older woman sitting in this, sepia color with the teacup looking out the window. Like no one in their 50s, 60s, 70s and beyond sees that as aspirational. So these have to feel aspirational. Thelma felt like an aspirational movie because just at a moment where most people feel they're most vulnerable, living in your late 80s, early 90s and being in a retirement community and feeling taken advantage of, she took the power back. That was a very satisfying experience for an audience. The other reason why that movie succeeded is it was made for $2 million.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
so,
yeah.
There wasn't like it wasn't a big risk. I mean, it was a risk because everybody's money is real, but that is the perfect price for what that movie is in order to reach an audience that it feels relevant for. The other thing I will say, adding to all of this, is there is almost always crossover. You almost always get a secondary younger audience with any of this. And that's there's reams upon reams of evidence of that you get the older audience, it's the primary audience, but you also get a much younger audience because they relate to the themes or they find it entertaining or whatever the case may be. And then I think the other thing to think about is never to make fun of them. Don't make something where you're making fun of the issues that these characters are going through.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I loved the Kaminsky method a few years ago, but it was really, in a lot of ways, it was, Michael Douglas and Alan Arkin, but in many ways it was very stereotypical. They were kind of old men, and Michael Douglas had sex. It was like older people had sex. Mm-hmm. It was kind of this revelatory thing that we all know is not revelatory. So I think I know the answer to the next question, but it is how frequent a topic of conversation is it in the industry about the kind of things we're talking about today, about including more mature people in film and TV? It was just something that doesn't really come up on a frequent basis.
I think, unfortunately, it doesn't come up as much as it should. I think one of the things that's been a big theme today is, the ism of ageism and how, we've done a really at least we've committed culturally to looking at sexism and racism and otherism, but I don't necessarily think the industry thinks about it. I think it's unconscious, not conscious. It doesn't think about ageism as one of those isms. So I don't think they're really thinking about a commitment to telling stories for a population that is growing as it, all the statistics that you all know, which is also one of the cases that I've always made to the Baer, which is, by 2030, there'll be more people over 65 than under 18. And those people have disposable time and income. They're still trained to go to the movies. They're not trained to watch 10-minute or 5-second things on their phones. So why would you not capitalize on that? So I think that it's an unconscious bias. I don't necessarily think it's conscious, but I don't see any real commitment. I think that part of what my personal mission is to continue to make the business case, because that is, like I said, what drives everybody's decisions. Nobody really is making decisions because they just love it. They're making it because they think they can get a new subscriber, they can sell an ad, or they can sell a ticket.
So how alone are you in this endeavor?
Pretty alone, but I'm really happy about that. Amblin Entertainment, Steven Spielberg's company, is pretty consistent. They're making a movie of a book adaptation called of the Thursday Murder Club, which is a very successful book series that Helen Mirren's starring in. And they tend to do movies in this space. There's another independent studio called Fifth Season who did 80 for Brady. They have a new movie they sold to Netflix. It's coming out this year called Nona's with Vince Vaughn. It was based on a true story about a guy who opens a restaurant in, I think, the Bronx with a bunch of local grandmothers, and they all cook and sort of rediscover themselves with their recipes. And so they do a little bit of it. And then everyone else is kind of a one-off, and I think there's real opportunity in it, particularly because it's hard to be a generalist anymore in Hollywood. You can't, especially as a producer, you can't really say, I'm going to make a little bit of everything. You have to really define yourself by certain kinds of movies that you make, and television shows. So I'm really comfortable being in it alone. I have no problem with that. And I also think you have to be smart about how many of these a year you can make, right? You can't flood the zone. It's not a horror movie where they come and go and there's always room for horror. I think you have to be really, in order to not dilute the opportunity, you have to be smart about it. And that's why I'm really excited about, and I know this was discussed on the last panel, about movies like The Substance and Baby Girl and Last Showgirl. If you guys haven't seen them, you really should, particularly as it pertains to the conversations we're having here today, because those are all movies about vibrant characters in their 50s having to make life decisions about who they want to be or who they have been or how they're going to keep going. And with the exception of Nicole Kidman, it's certainly not lost that both Pam Anderson and Demi Moore were written off, right? Everybody just figured they were hot 30 years ago, and but they can't do that anymore. And they're really, really relevant, and they're really successful. But they're also about something that's relatable to a larger audience. It's not just simply about you're getting old or you're aging or you have wrinkles on your face. It's a very human theme that they're in all three of those movies that they're exploring.
So what other strategies can be employed to change the stereotypical portrayal of older people? And what can this audience do to help change that narrative?
Well, okay. The first thing I would say here to this audience, I'm going to start with the second part first, is data and investment. The more data that can be collected on the value of this audience, the more money will flow into creating content for this audience, which will make it a virtuous cycle, because as they start to make money on their investment, they will realize there's an opportunity here. And I had learned when I came to an advisory council meeting, I think maybe last year or the year before, I can't remember. There was a conversation about a case study about Cadillac had tried to get into a different demographic. And what they discovered by surprise was that an older demographic was way more interested in their new cars than the younger one. And they pivoted and became very successful. So I think data, please, for those researchers out there, and investment for those of you who are either investment bankers or VC or MBA students. It's important, and it doesn't take a lot. This is not about, multi-million-dollar budgets and things like that. There's a very small amount of seed investment can go a long way.
Well, I want to pursue the investment question a little bit more. I remember back when we were doing the movie 61 HBO, a friend of mine got involved in it, and he said that 3 reasons people invest in entertainment projects are in this order. They like being near celebrities.
Yep.
They like telling their friends, and way down the list is they might make money.
Sure.
So how can you convince this wonderful audience that investing in these projects is a financially wise thing to do?
Because I think that the first thing to do is to invest in the incubation of these projects, which that means the early stage development, in the same way that you would invest in R&D in Silicon Valley or in pharmaceuticals or in automotive. Pick a sector where there's R&D and you have to figure out new ways of doing things and new technology. I think it's really important to invest in the early stages of storytelling, which is scripts and budgets and packaging and things like that. You don't have to go into this with a huge amount of money to fund production. I think the second thing is to make sure that the people who are you're investing in and the companies you're investing in have a very clear point of view about how they're going to reach the audience, have a very clear point of view about how they're going to manage their costs. And I think being able to look at a historical, which is easy to pull, historicals on some of the movies of the last 10 years and the television shows in the last 10 years that have succeeded in this space. You know, you mentioned Grace and Frankie. Grace and Frankie was the longest running show on Netflix. Netflix is famous for canceling shows after the second or third year. And Grace and Frankie ran for 6 years. And I know that sounds like not that long because like The Simpsons have been on for 25 years, but the streaming business is very different than the networks. But that ran for 6 years because it was so radically successful for them. So there are different metrics and different distribution platforms, obviously. But I think it's pretty easy to quantify.
So should we move to questions? Are there any online questions?
Yes. One question that comes from the online audience is, there is this narrative that we've heard across several discussions today, that older adults have disposable income and have the time to go to the movies. And the question is, to what degree does Hollywood or any other industry really considers the fact that this is not true for many older adults? And is there any attempt to reach out to older adults who cannot afford to go to the movies or streaming services?
I think it's a great question. I think when you talk about disposable income, I think it's more or less across entertainment. I could spend a whole nother hour on exhibition, which is the ticket prices, and it's the only business in the world that doesn't have dynamic pricing. I defy you to find another industry that doesn't alter their pricings based on demand, but that's a different thing. But I do think that there are obviously many people who can't afford $15 to go to a movie, or, $80 plus babysitter, whatever, when you're talking about taking, a family of 4 or not taking babies or whatever the case may be. But I do think even there are ways to create content on free broadcast television that will be relevant to this audience. And by virtue of that, you can make there's another show that just premiered this week that's Tim Allen and Kat Dennings on ABC. I'm forgetting the name of the show, but it is about an adult child that moves back in with their father. And the dynamic of, which is a very real dynamic in our society right now, it's a dynamic that is very relatable. And it was a very successful premiere on network television. So again, it's just about finding ways to reach that audience. It doesn't mean they have to take their dollars, especially if you're on a fixed income, and go out to a movie or sign up for a subscription in order to watch something. we can find ways to put it right on, broadcast television, which is free.
Anybody from the audience?
Right there.
Thank you. I was curious about talent pipeline development, especially given your comment about early stage investment.
Yeah.
With some of the other isms, we've seen purpose-built, training programs or mentorship, incubation kind of programs to support creators who are able to tell stories that reach specific populations. Do you see any of that focused on the creators that are telling stories that are resonant with these populations? And is there anything different that either is already true or that needs to be true about those incubation efforts, given this population and these kinds of stories?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So my own experience, the first part of what you're asking is, I don't think there's any distinct effort, incubate the sort of product development or content development is development, is R&D. And I don't see any specific pipelines to, we should be developing, specifically for this audience. That's what I was doing and will continue to do, but I don't see any formal initiative. What I found really interesting is it is a space that you either have to understand and relate to if you're not the age of the people. So in the case of Thelma, it was the writer director wrote it about his grandmother who had gone through this, and he had a very acute understanding from an emotional level, which is why I think it rang true. So there are some creators who really relate to characters like this, and there are a lot of creators who are of the age who have stories to tell and need the opportunity. I will say, and again, it could be a whole nother panel, one area where ageism is really rampant in Hollywood is with the writers. It is very difficult for older writers to remain employed. And that has to do with the hierarchy, and particularly in television, of the writer's room and how they staff and things like that. It's easier if you're a screenwriter because you're writing on your own. So it really, but when in an ecosystem where it's contracting anyway, and people want to sell things, it's hard to write things on spec unless you know that there's an initiative and a commitment for someone to be doing it. And I never had, and continue to not have, a dearth of submissions because they exist. We just need the sort of commensurate commitment to seeing it get made. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more now. Anyone else? Well, we don't have any more, so that's great. Okay.
All of a sudden, two more.
Hello. Oh, hi. I actually have a question from the online audience. So Beatrice is really interested in writing a reality TV hook, and she's wondering where she could go to get started on that. Where can she learn to throw a pitch or
on reality TV?
Mhm.
I would recommend truly Googling it, how to build, because there are really good online decks that can explain to you how to build a reality TV pitch. By the way, another area that's actually doing well in this space, there was the Obama produced show, Later Daters, the Golden Bachelor, Golden Bachelorette. Those are all areas where this is gaining traction, which is really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
The interesting thing about the question was about the age of the audience for the movie The Apprentice. I wish I could give you specific information because we were so pressed for time to release the film that we never tested it. We never had a proper test screening to understand who the audience was. I can only give anecdotal feedback based on, audience reviews and things like that. And it skewed older, which I would have expected it to. So, it would have been really great if we could have, but given all of the things that we were up against, we literally ran out of time. By the time we were finally cleared to accept our distribution deal, we had 6 weeks. So, so it was, someday we'll do a deeper dive on that, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you all, and we really appreciate your participation.
Thank you.